My name is Rochelle. At 34 years old, I have learned that the people who carry your shared DNA are often the exact same people waiting to bleed you dry. If you have ever stood alone against a family that treated your hard work like a communal bank account, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, because this journey is not for the faint of heart, and your support means everything to me. For 15 consecutive years, our annual family retreat was a sacred tradition. It was an untouchable week of bonding in the Berkshires that I personally spent my adult years planning, organizing, and executing. I used my extensive background in corporate restructuring and event design to negotiate the rates, coordinate the luxury caterers, and even build custom welcome baskets for each relative. My mother always took the credit, but the entire family knew I was the engine that kept our image of perfection running. Then my marriage collapsed after I discovered my husband James had been having a 3-year affair with his assistant. Right after the divorce, my company downsized and I lost my executive position. Instead of offering comfort, my family treated my trauma like a social embarrassment. My mother asked why I could not just look the other way, while my father told me that failure did not belong in our family circle. They maintained a cozy relationship with my cheating ex-husband, funding my siblings' lavish lifestyles while forcing me to accept what they called independence. When my mother called to say there simply was not enough space for me at this year's luxury retreat in the Catskills, I believed her flimsy excuse about tight sleeping arrangements. I thought it was just another subtle punishment for being the divorced single middle child who ruined their perfect family aesthetic. I had no idea that while 66 members of my extended family were being welcomed with open arms, my parents had extended a special invitation to my ex-husband James, handing him the very room that should have been mine. The betrayal did not stop at the retreat line. It marched straight into my sanctuary. Last Tuesday, I returned home after an exhausting 14-hour day on the corporate battlefield. As a senior partner in corporate restructuring and debt acquisition, my job is to walk into failing empires, strip away the rot, and repossess what is rightfully owed to my firm. I had just finalized a brutal, multi-million-dollar corporate debt acquisition, and my body ached for the quiet safety of my home. I adjusted the lapels of my sharp-tailored suit, stepped into the private elevator, and scanned my biometric thumbprint to ascend to my $3 million penthouse in the heart of Buckhead, Atlanta. This space was my crown jewel. It was 4,000 square feet of glass, marble, and concrete, purchased entirely with my own money, and decorated with a curated art collection I had spent a decade assembling. But the moment the elevator doors slid open directly into my foyer, the scent of expensive security was replaced by the overwhelming smell of cheap cologne and absolute entitlement. The heavy metal security door had been bypassed. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a sudden icy wave of recognition. In the center of my gallery hallway stood my sister-in-law, Monique. She was tossing my custom-framed limited edition art prints directly onto the hardwood floor, stacking them like worthless cardboard against the wall. Two burly movers were hauling a massive velvet-upholstered baby crib past my dining table. Monique turned around, her eyes sweeping over my tailored suit before she locked her gaze onto me with a smug, toxic smile. She casually rested her hand on her pregnant stomach and leaned against my marble kitchen island. She told me to calm down and stated that they were just rearranging the layout to make the space more functional for a growing family. She said my abstract paintings were too dark for a child's development anyway, and she was converting my private home office into a nursery for the new baby. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her words, my brother Trey strolled out of my master bedroom. He was wearing one of my late grandfather's vintage watches, a piece he had stolen from my mother's house years ago, and carrying his designer leather suitcases. Trey smiled his hollow, charismatic smile, the same smile he used whenever he was pitching a fraudulent app or begging our parents for a bailout after his latest business venture went bankrupt. He looked at me as if I were a guest disrupting his check-in time and told me that he was taking the master suite because the natural light was better for Monique's morning anxiety. Then, the final player stepped out of the shadow of my living room terrace. My father, Clarence. He walked with the heavy, unyielding stride of a retired contractor who was used to barking orders on a construction site. He stood between Trey and me, his arms crossed over his chest, his face completely devoid of remorse. He did not ask how my day was. He did not ask how I was surviving the aftermath of my corporate downsizing. He simply looked at the private elevator, then looked back at me. With a voice as cold and absolute as a judge passing sentence, Clarence delivered the fatal line that severed our biological bond forever. He placed the heavy brass keys to my penthouse into Trey's palm, looked me straight in the eyes, and said coldly, "Your brother is the one who deserves to live here." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the penthouse. Monique let out a sharp, triumphant giggle, already reaching for her phone to take a selfie in her new luxury kitchen. Trey casually flipped the brass key ring around his finger, his entitlement oozing through his designer clothes. They stood there as a unified front three people who shared my blood, fully believing that their collective desire could override my legal rights. They thought I would crumble. They expected the old Rochelle, the middle child, who spent her entire life accommodating their priorities, planning their retreats, and swallowing her own pain to preserve the illusion of family harmony, to break down into tears. They were counting on my desire for peace to make me small. But they did not realize that the woman standing before them was no longer the desperate girl begging for a seat at their table. The corporate world had hardened me. Dealing with ruthless executives and stripping assets had taught me exactly how to handle hostile takeovers. I did not shout. I did not protest. I did not let a single trace of emotion breach the calm facade of my face. Instead, a slow, cold smile tugged at the corners of my lips. It was the exact same smile I wore right before I dismantled a failing company and stripped its founders of their equity. I looked at my father, Clarence, whose face was rigid with patriarchal arrogance. I looked at Trey, the golden child who had burned through 3 separate careers, defaulted on multiple car loans, and drained our parents' Hootry accounts just to maintain the fungbat lifestyle of a successful entrepreneur. Finally, I looked at Monique, who was already instructing the movers to take my hand-woven rugs out to the balcony. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and unlocked the screen. I did not dial my mother, and I did not dial a family counselor. I dialed the direct emergency line for Buckhead Luxury High-Rise Security and placed the call on speakerphone so every single person in the room could hear the exact moment their reality shattered. The line connected on the first ring. A sharp professional voice answered, stating that this was building security and asking how they could assist. I kept my eyes locked directly onto my father's face as the color began to drain from his skin. I spoke clearly into the microphone, my tone conversational and completely unbothered. I stated my name and confirmed that I was the sole legal owner of Penthouse 1991. I reported that there were multiple intruders who had illegally bypassed my biometric security, broken into my home, and were currently occupying the property and destroying my personal assets. I requested immediate intervention and stated that I was authorizing the use of law enforcement to have the trespassers removed from the premises. Within seconds, the smug satisfaction vanished from Trey's perfect smile. Monique's hand dropped from her stomach as she stared at the phone in disbelief, realizing that the luxury Buckhead life she was about to manifest on social media was evaporating before her eyes. My father's jaw tightened, his posture fracturing, as the absolute weight of his mistake began to sink in. They had Dan Thun into a corporate restructuring executive's territory, fully expecting a family drama. They had no idea that they had just walked straight into a legal ambush, and the execution was already underway. Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy oak double doors of the penthouse lobby swung open. 3 officers from the Atlanta Police Department stepped into the expansive foyer, their heavy-duty belts clinking against their dark uniforms. Leading them was Officer Darius, a broad-shouldered veteran who scanned the chaotic scene with an immediate look of professional skepticism. He took in the displaced artwork leaning haphazardly against the pristine walls, the moving boxes stacked carelessly on my custom rugs, and the incredibly tense standoff between the 4 of us. Before Officer Darius could even clear his throat to ask a single question about the nature of the emergency call, Clarence launched directly into his highly practiced performance. He stepped forward quickly, holding his hands up in a gesture of peaceful surrender, while physically blocking the officers from getting closer to me. He intentionally lowered his voice, pitching it perfectly, to sound like an exhausted but entirely reasonable patriarch dealing with a highly unruly child. Officer. My father began shaking his head with a perfectly executed look of deep sorrow. I apologize sincerely for wasting your valuable time tonight. There is absolutely no emergency happening here. This is just a simple family misunderstanding that got a little bit out of hand. My daughter Rochelle has been under an immense amount of stress at her demanding corporate job lately, and she tends to get quite hysterical when she is surprised. We simply came over to help her organize her extra space for her older brother, who is expecting a new baby soon. She is just having an emotional reaction to the sudden change. It is entirely a private family matter and we are sorting it out. Trey nodded enthusiastically from the background, puffing out his chest to appear authoritative. He chimed in, claiming loudly that I was just being selfish with my space and that they were trying to handle things internally as a family unit should. Monique crossed her arms defensively over her maternity blouse, offering the uniformed officers a condescending, knowing smile. She whispered loudly enough for everyone in the foyer to hear that some career-obsessed women just cannot handle the immense pressure of being alone and taking it out on their loved ones. Officer Darius looked at me, his expression shifting slightly as he absorbed their coordinated narrative. In a bustling city like Atlanta, where extreme wealth and bitter family disputes often intertwined in messy public ways, he had likely seen this exact scenario play out 100 times before. A wealthy family having a loud dispute over shared property. He pulled a small black notepad from his chest pocket and asked if I was indeed the individual who made the emergency call. He suggested firmly that if this was actually a civil dispute regarding shared family property, the police department could not officially intervene, and we would need to handle the eviction process in civil court. Clarence smiled, a victorious, sickeningly warm expression that made my blood run cold. He actually reached out to pat the veteran officer on the shoulder, thanking him profusely for his understanding and patience. He turned to me and suggested condescendingly that I go into the kitchen to calm down with a glass of water while they finished moving the heavy furniture. He told the police officers they were free to leave, assuring them he had the entire situation completely under his control. The sheer arrogance radiating from him was staggering. They truly believed that the patriarchal authority Clarence wielded with an iron fist in my childhood home would magically extend to my corporate-funded real estate. They firmly thought a few calm, manipulative words from an older man would completely override the law. They foolishly thought I would shrink back into the shadows and dutifully accept my role as the sacrificial lamb for Trey's ultimate benefit. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not match their frantic, desperate energy. I simply stepped around the massive marble kitchen island and walked directly to the hidden wall safe concealed perfectly behind a sliding panel of reclaimed oak. I quickly tapped in the digital combination, retrieved a crisp manila folder containing my most vital documents, and walked calmly back to the waiting officers. I slapped the heavy legal document onto the black marble countertop. The sharp sound echoed loudly across the quiet penthouse, silencing my father instantly. I told Officer Darius to read the deed thoroughly. I explained that my name and my name alone was registered on the official title of this luxury property. I clarified emphatically that there was no shared family trust, no parental cosigner, and absolutely no legal basis whatsoever for anyone else to claim residency or ownership. I stated clearly that the three people standing in my hallway did not live here, did not pay property taxes here, and were definitely not invited guests. Clarence lost his warm, fatherly smile in a fraction of a second. His jaw clenched tightly as he tried to interrupt the officer, insisting angrily that I was lying and that hidden family money had been used to purchase the unit. He demanded the officers ignore the paperwork and listen to him. But Officer Darius was already reading the official county seal on the deed, his professional demeanor shifting instantly from a neutral mediator to active law enforcement. I was not entirely finished destroying their illusion. I picked up my tablet from the sleek console table and synced it wirelessly to the massive smart screen mounted on the living room wall. I told the officers that my father claimed this was a friendly surprise family visit. I asked them to watch exactly how this loving family visit truly began. I hit play on the remote. The high-definition 4K security footage from the private elevator lobby filled the massive screen illuminating the room. The crisp video clearly showed Clarence, Trey, and Monique arriving exactly an hour earlier. It also prominently showed a locksmith wearing a gray uniform working intently on my secondary reinforced security door with heavy power tools. The integrated audio was crystal clear, capturing every damning word. The footage captured Clarence handing the locksmith a thick stack of cash, telling the man to hurry up because they desperately needed to change all the locks before the rightful owner returned from work. It captured Trey laughing maliciously and saying that they were finally going to take what they deserved from their selfish sister. Officer Darius watched the massive screen, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. The other two backup officers immediately moved their hands to rest near their utility belts, shifting their tactical stances to completely block the main exit to the elevator. The atmosphere in the penthouse plummeted to freezing. I turned to my father and asked smoothly if he still wanted to call this a simple misunderstanding. I looked directly into Officer Darius's eyes and stated that I was officially pressing charges to the fullest extent of the law. I informed the authorities that this was no longer a trivial civil dispute over real estate. They had deliberately hired a third party to drill through high security locks to gain unauthorized access to my private residence. I demanded they be arrested immediately for felony breaking and entering. The air was forcefully sucked out of the room. The harsh reality of the situation finally crashed down heavily on the arrogant intruders. The protective, comfortable bubble of family privilege popped instantly against the sharp, unforgiving edge of the law. Clarence stammered helplessly, taking a step backward away from the officers. He looked wildly at the security screen, then at the armed police, his previous supreme confidence evaporating completely into raw, undeniable panic. Officer Darius stepped forward purposefully, pulling a pair of heavy silver handcuffs from his duty belt. He looked directly at Trey and Monique, ordering them in a booming voice to pack up their personal belongings and exit the premises immediately. He informed them strictly that they were trespassing on private property and that if they did not leave voluntarily right this second, they would be physically removed by force. Trey stood completely paralyzed by the sudden turn of events. His entire life, he had been entirely shielded from facing real consequences. Whenever he failed a college class, wrecked an expensive sports car, or bankrupted a promising business, Clarence had always been right there to write a massive check and smooth things over with the authorities. Facing a uniformed officer giving him a direct, lawful order shattered his incredibly fragile golden child ego into tiny pieces. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of crimson. He began shouting uncontrollably, waving his arms wildly in the air. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he was the rightful heir to the family legacy, that he was the eldest son, and that he was absolutely not leaving the luxury penthouse. He lunged forward aggressively, losing all sense of rationality. He shoved Officer Darius squarely in the broad chest, screaming violently that no one was going to humiliate him in front of his pregnant wife. It was undeniably the worst mistake of his highly privileged life. The physical reaction from the police was instantaneous and brutal. Officer Darius and the two backup officers swarmed him simultaneously. Within seconds, Trey was slammed face first onto the polished hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The sound of his expensive designer sunglasses cracking sharply against the wood echoed through the large room. The sharp, metallic click of the silver bracelets locking tightly around his wrists sounded like absolute music to my ears. He thrashed and kicked against the floorboards, but the heavy officers pinned him down effortlessly, reading him his Miranda rights loudly over his desperate, pathetic yelling. He was being formally charged with criminal trespassing and assaulting a police officer. Monique watched her arrogant husband being pinned forcefully to the floor and completely lost her mind. She let out a piercing, theatrical scream that vibrated off the glass walls. Instead of rushing to help him or begging the officers for mercy, she turned her blinding fury entirely toward me. She grabbed the edge of my marble console table and violently swiped her arm across the surface. My imported ceramic vase, an exquisite historical piece I had acquired at a private auction for $20,000, crashed heavily to the floor, shattering into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. She shrieked wildly that I was a heartless monster and a jealous, bitter woman who hated seeing her brother happy. One of the backup officers immediately grabbed Monique firmly by the arm, restraining her physically and forcing her toward the open elevator doors. She cursed at me endlessly, promising loudly that divine justice would punish me severely for what I had maliciously done to her growing family. Trey was hauled roughly to his feet, his tailored designer suit heavily wrinkled and covered in floor dust, his face wet with humiliating tears of defeat. As the officers dragged the sobbing golden child and his screaming belligerent wife into the waiting elevator, Clarence remained standing alone in the foyer. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with uncontrolled toxic rage. He looked down at the shattered expensive vase on the floor and then slowly looked up at me. His eyes were dark, completely devoid of any remaining paternal warmth or affection. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. He swore viciously that I had just crossed a dangerous line I could never possibly uncross. He declared with absolute venom that I had deliberately sent my own flesh and blood to a cold jail cell, and that he would personally make sure I paid for it dearly. He promised vehemently to ruin me in this city, to entirely destroy my professional name, and to leave me with absolutely nothing but regrets. I stood perfectly still, my posture impeccable and my expression entirely unbothered by his dramatic threats. I simply stared back at the man who had tried to steal my hard-earned sanctuary and told him to get out of my house. The bait was a gilded invitation to the annual Black Excellence Empowerment Gala held at the historic Fox Theater in downtown Atlanta. It is the undisputed social event of the season, a night where the city's most affluent power players gather to drink premium champagne, write massive tax-deductible checks, and aggressively network. I knew Clarence and Monique would never miss it. They needed the social validation too, desperately. More importantly, they needed fresh capital. With Trey's legal fees mounting and their fraudulent shell companies collapsing, they were on the hunt for new unsuspecting investors. I stood in the shadowed alcove of the VIP mezzanine, looking down at the glittering sea of custom tuxedos and designer evening gowns. From my elevated vantage point, I had a perfect unobstructed view of my family working the ballroom floor. Clarence was in his element. He wore a crisp velvet dinner jacket, his silver hair perfectly brushed back, looking every bit the distinguished elder statesman. He was holding court near the main bar, speaking in hushed, serious tones to a group of prominent real estate developers. I watched as he placed a heavy hand over his heart, shaking his head in mock sorrow. Even from the balcony, I knew exactly what narrative he was spinning. He was playing the wounded patriarch burdened by a ruthless, ungrateful daughter who had lost her mind to corporate greed. Monique was entirely complicit in the performance. She stood a few feet away, strategically displaying her pregnant belly to a circle of wealthy philanthropists' wives. She wore an expression of practiced exhaustion, sipping sparkling water and wiping away invisible tears as she recounted the completely fabricated story of her vicious eviction. I watched her point a trembling finger toward her stomach, undoubtedly claiming that the stress I had caused was threatening the health of her unborn child. They were systematically extracting sympathy and using it as a currency to secure introductions to angel investors for Trey's next invisible venture. They were absolutely oblivious to the fact that their entire audience was drinking my champagne. The event organizers had kept the identity of the evening's primary benefactor strictly confidential at my specific request. Clarence and Monique were completely unaware that the anonymous diamond sponsor who had bankrolled the entire $1 million gala was standing right above them. Right? They were happily dancing in a ballroom that I had essentially purchased for the night. The arrogance it takes to smear a woman's name in a room funded by her own bank account is truly staggering. I swirled the amber liquid in my crystal glass, my eyes tracking their every movement. I had spent the last 7 days enduring their vicious gossip mill, watching my corporate clients question my stability. Tonight the bill for their slander was coming due, The charity director took the main stage, tapping the microphone to signal the start of the formal program. The heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed, and the massive projector screens illuminated the stage with the gala's elegant gold logo. I watched as the director approached the podium to announce the keynote speaker. Clarence had aggressively lobbied the charity board for this speaking slot, using his outdated reputation as a community pillar to secure 10 minutes of uninterrupted microphone time. He intended to use this platform to cement his status as a victim and publicly solidify my social exile. The crowd offered polite applause as Clarence confidently climbed the steps to the stage. He adjusted his microphone, cleared his throat, and looked out over the sea of Atlanta's elite. He began his speech with practiced charisma, speaking grandly about the fundamental importance of legacy and generational wealth. Then he executed his pivot right on cue. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of profound paternal disappointment. He spoke about the tragedy of youth losing their moral compass. He warned the audience about the dangerous, toxic nature of corporate ambition, claiming it poisons the mind and destroys the sacred bonds of family. He dramatically stated that he had recently experienced this heartbreak within his own home, completely betrayed by someone he had loved and nurtured. He then seamlessly transitioned to praising Trey, hailing his eldest son as a resilient, brilliant entrepreneur who was currently overcoming unfair, malicious obstacles to build a beautiful future for his growing family. He was subtly asking the room to open their checkbooks for his golden child. I set my glass down on the mezzanine railing. I caught the eye of the lead audiovisual director stationed in the control booth across the theater. I had personally handed him a highly encrypted platinum drive 2 hours before the event began, along with a $5,000 cash tip for his absolute discretion. I gave him a single sharp nod. The giant high-definition projector screens behind Clarence instantly flickered. The elegant gold charity logo vanished completely. The ballroom plunged into a momentary confused silence as a series of massive high-resolution documents suddenly plastered the screens across the entire stage. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. Directly behind Clarence's head, spanning 20 feet wide, was a crystal-clear image of Trey's official credit report, displaying an abysmal score of 412. The screens cycled rapidly, seamlessly transitioning to the next piece of undeniable evidence. A certified eviction notice from a luxury high-rise apartment complex. A final notice of default on a $200,000 business loan. The absolute centerpiece was a magnified, highlighted copy of a federal tax lien filed against one of Trey's fake shell companies bearing Clarence's own forged signature as the guarantor. The room erupted into frantic murmurs. Cell phones were instantly pulled from expensive purses as hundreds of Atlanta's most influential socialites began photographing the catastrophic financial evidence displayed on the main stage. Clarence, completely oblivious to the digital execution happening behind him, smiled at the crowd, assuming their gasps were reactions to his powerful speech. He raised his hands, asking for quiet. It was only when a man in the front row pointed directly at the massive screens that Clarence finally turned around. I watched his entire body lock into rigid, paralyzed shock. The color drained from his face as he stared at the 20-foot-tall display of his son's fraudulent empire and his own financial ruin. He stood frozen at the podium, his mouth opening and closing, without a single sound escaping his lips. I stepped out from the shadowed mezzanine and began my descent down the sweeping grand staircase that led directly to the ballroom floor. The heavy silence of the crowd parted like the Red Sea as I walked purposefully toward the stage. I was wearing a flawless blood-red custom gown that commanded absolute attention. Every eye in the historic theater tracked my movement. The whispers intensified, identifying me as the daughter Clarence had just spent the last week actively destroying. I glided up the stage steps, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. I walked directly past my paralyzed father, whose eyes were now wide with a mixture of pure terror and blinding rage. I smoothly removed the microphone from his trembling hand. I turned to face the audience, projecting my voice with cold, surgical precision. "Good evening," I said, my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of any hysteria. For those of you who have been subjected to the aggressive slander campaigns over the past 7 days, allow me to formally introduce myself. My name is Rochelle. I am the senior partner at Vanguard Obsidian, and I am the anonymous diamond sponsor who funded this beautiful gala tonight. A shocked murmur rippled through the sea of guests. I gestured effortlessly to the massive screens illuminating the undeniable truth of my family's corruption. The man standing behind me just spoke to you about legacy and investment. I continued, my eyes locking onto the wealthy developers Clarence had been schmoozing earlier. But as you can clearly see on the screens behind me, there is a massive difference between a legacy and a profound financial liability. When you strip away the tailored suits and the hollow speeches, you are left with parasites. Individuals who drain resources, manipulate the innocent, and disguise their sheer incompetence as family loyalty. I advise you all, as a seasoned professional in corporate restructuring, to never invest your hard-earned capital into a rotting foundation. Clarence shattered, his carefully constructed mask of dignified elder statesman dissolved into pure, unadulterated savagery. The public humiliation in front of the exact society he worshipped broke his mind. He let out a guttural roar of pure hatred. He dropped his head and charged directly at me across the stage, his fists clenched, intending to cause severe physical harm. I did not flinch. I did not step back. In his blind, mindless fury, Clarence failed to see the thick black audio cable coiled near the podium monitor. His expensive leather shoe caught the heavy wire mid-stride. His forward momentum betrayed him completely. He pitched violently forward, his arms flailing wildly in the air to break his descent. He went down incredibly hard. His face planted directly onto the polished wooden stage with a sickening heavy thud. The microphone stand toppled over, adding a loud screech of audio feedback to the chaotic scene. The high-end private security detail I had personally hired for the evening swarmed the stage instantly. 3 large men in dark suits hauled my groaning, bleeding father up from the floor by his armpits. He was bleeding from his lip, spitting wild, incoherent curses at me as they dragged him aggressively toward the service exit. Monique was standing frozen in the middle of the ballroom, entirely surrounded by the wealthy women she had been lying to just minutes prior. The women were now looking at her with absolute disgust, stepping away from her, as if she were carrying a plague. Monique covered her face with her designer clutch and scurried frantically toward the exit, chasing after the security guards who were hauling her humiliated father-in-law out the back door. I stood alone in the center of the stage, the massive screens still broadcasting their financial ruin. The social execution was absolutely flawless. In less than 10 minutes, I had permanently exiled them from Atlanta's elite society. I handed the microphone calmly back to the stunned event director, smoothed the fabric of my red gown, and walked back down the stairs, leaving the wreckage of my family's reputation burning brightly in my wake. The morning after the charity gala, my phone remained completely silent. There were no more concerned calls from corporate clients and no more hesitant inquiries from my investors. The absolute public dismantling of Clarence and Trey had sent a shockwave through the Atlanta elite, instantly vaporizing their credibility and solidifying mine. I had cut the head off the snake in front of 400 witnesses. But an animal backed into a corner, with absolutely nothing left to lose, is always at its most dangerous. Clarence was socially dead and financially ruined. His country club memberships were suspended, and his church community had completely turned their backs on him. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of delusion. He could not accept that the daughter he viewed as worthless had bested him. He needed to reclaim his power, and since he could no longer fight me in the court of public opinion, he decided to drag me into the court of law. Exactly 14 days after the gala, I was sitting at my desk reviewing an acquisition portfolio when my executive assistant buzzed my intercom. She sounded unusually tense as she informed me that a gentleman was in the lobby, insisting on handing a package directly to me. I knew exactly what it was before the heavy glass doors of my office even swung open. The process server was a young man in a cheap suit, looking completely out of place in the sleek, ultra-modern corridors of Vanguard Obsidian. He approached my desk nervously, verified my name, and handed me a thick manila envelope. "You have been served," he mumbled quickly before turning and practically sprinting out of the office. I did not blink. I picked up my silver letter opener, sliced cleanly through the top of the envelope, and slid the heavy stack of legal documents onto my pristine desk. It was a civil lawsuit filed in the Superior Court of Fulton County. Clarence was officially suing me. I scanned the preliminary injunctions and the list of demands, my eyes tracking over the dense, aggressive legal jargon. My father was not suing for a simple apology or a retraction. He was demanding a full 50% equity stake in Vanguard Obsidian and 50% ownership of my Buckhead penthouse. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. The sheer audacity was staggering. I flipped to the statement of claims to see exactly what kind of fictional narrative his attorneys had concocted to justify seizing half of my empire. The entire multi-million-dollar lawsuit hinged on a single transaction from a decade ago. When I was 19 years old, I was working 2 jobs to pay my way through my undergraduate degree, while Trey was burning through our parents' money at private universities. I had fallen short on my tuition payment for my final semester. Clarence had reluctantly written me a check for exactly $5,000. He had handed it to me with a lecture about my poor financial planning and reminded me that I owed him my life. I had paid that money back within 2 years of graduating, but that did not matter to his legal team. His high-priced, slick defense attorney had brilliantly categorized that ancient $5,000 tuition check as an initial angel investment. They were arguing in a federal court that this single payment constituted the foundational seed capital for my entire corporate career. Because he had funded my education, they claimed he was legally entitled to half of every single dollar I had generated since graduation. I looked at the signature of the opposing counsel on the last page. Attorney Marcus Sterling. He was a notorious legal predator in Atlanta, known for representing desperate wealthy families in highly publicized, messy civil disputes. Sterling did not win cases in the courtroom. He won them by filing aggressive, embarrassing lawsuits that threatened to expose his targets to endless media scrutiny. He banked entirely on the fact that high-level executives like myself would quietly pay massive, multi-million-dollar settlements just to make the public headache go away. He assumed I would panic at the thought of a lengthy, drawn-out legal battle jeopardizing my firm. He assumed I would throw a few $1,000,000 at Clarence just to sever the tie permanently. He assumed completely incorrectly. Within the hour, the senior legal counsel for Vanguard Obsidian was sitting in my office reviewing the lawsuit. He offered to immediately file a motion to dismiss, calling the claims frivolous and predatory. He assured me that our corporate legal team could tie Marcus Sterling up in endless litigation for years, bleeding Clarence dry with legal fees. I held up my hand, silencing him. I instructed my general counsel to step down from the case. I told him that Vanguard Obsidian would not be retaining outside defense counsel and that I would not be utilizing our internal legal department. I was going to file the paperwork to represent myself pro se. My senior lawyer looked at me as if I had lost my mind, warning me that representing myself in a high-stakes corporate equity lawsuit was incredibly dangerous. But I understood something he did not. This was not a corporate battle. This was a blood war, and I needed to hold the blade myself. I knew exactly how Clarence and Marcus Sterling operated. I knew that a $5,000 canceled check from 10 years ago would never hold up in front of a judge as legitimate seed capital for a modern private equity firm. It was far too weak. Sterling knew it was weak too, which meant they were going to manufacture something stronger. They were going to fabricate evidence to support their ridiculous narrative. They were banking on the fact that I would hire a traditional defense attorney who would argue the law. They did not realize they were dealing with a forensic accountant who specialized in dismantling fraudulent corporate structures. I spent the next 3 weeks meticulously preparing my trap. I did not file a motion to dismiss. Instead, I welcomed the lawsuit, welcoming the discovery phase with open arms. I wanted them to feel confident. I wanted them to believe their intimidation tactics were working perfectly. I knew Clarence. I knew his profound arrogance. He would inevitably produce forged documents to guarantee his victory. He would create fake partnership agreements drafted on backdated letterheads. He would suddenly discover old printed emails, supposedly showing me promising him half of my future earnings. He would fabricate a paper trail that looked flawless to the naked eye. I turned my penthouse into a digital war room. I bypassed standard legal defense strategies and went straight for the digital jugular. I quietly prepared aggressive subpoenas, targeting the metadata of every single piece of electronic evidence they planned to submit. I drafted court orders to compel the internet service providers to release the IP logs and server routing histories of Clarence and Trey's personal devices. I knew that when people forge digital documents, they almost always leave behind a microscopic digital fingerprint. They save a file with a modern software version. They alter a timestamp that does not match the server registry. They forward an email from an IP address that did not exist 10 years ago. I methodically built an invisible ironclad net around their entire legal strategy. I anticipated every single piece of perjury they were preparing to commit. I organized my defense binders with terrifying precision, cross-referencing legal precedents with deep-level cyber forensics. I was not just preparing to defend my assets. I was preparing to let them walk confidently into a federal courtroom, raise their right hands, swear an oath to God, and commit massive, undeniable felonies on the public record. I wanted them to present their fake emails. I wanted them to submit their forged contracts. I wanted Marcus Sterling to stand before the judge and stake his entire legal career on evidence created by two desperate frauds. I laid my paper trail trap with the patience of a sniper. I did not send angry letters. I did not request settlement negotiations. I simply filed my Pro C paperwork and waited in the shadows. Let Clarence think he had cornered me. Let Trey believe he was finally going to get his hands on my wealth. They thought the courtroom was their arena. They had no idea they were walking into a slaughterhouse, and I was the one holding the lock on the door. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse swung open, signaling the beginning of the end for my family. The courtroom was a cavernous space of dark wood and polished brass smelling faintly of lemon polish and ancient paper. I sat entirely alone at the defense table. My sleek charcoal suit contrasted sharply with the empty leather chairs beside me. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's table was crowded. Clarence sat in the center, flanked by Marcus Sterling and two junior associates who looked eager to witness a corporate execution. Trey sat directly behind them in the first row of the gallery, wearing a tailored navy suit paid for by another defaulted credit card. Beside him sat Monique. She caught my eye and offered a sickening, triumphant smirk, resting both hands on her pregnant belly as if shielding her unborn child from my dark presence. She was already mentally spending the millions she assumed they were about to extract from my bank accounts. Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense veteran of the civil court, called the room to order. He cast a brief, skeptical glance in my direction. Judges rarely favor defendants who choose to represent themselves, especially in complex equity disputes involving millions of dollars. He assumed I was an arrogant executive too cheap or too stubborn to hire proper counsel. He had no idea I was simply a predator who preferred to hunt alone. Marcus Sterling stood buttoning his custom suit jacket with a theatrical flourish. He approached the podium with the swagger of a man who believed the verdict was already written. He began his opening statement, painting a masterful tragic portrait of Clarence. He described my father as a selfless patriarch, a man who had sacrificed his own financial stability to fund his daughter's education, only to be cast aside once she achieved staggering wealth. Sterling's voice echoed through the courtroom, vibrating with righteous indignation as he spun a tale of corporate greed and filial betrayal. Clarence played his part beautifully, keeping his head bowed occasionally, removing his glasses to pinch the bridge of his nose as if overwhelmed by the heartbreak of suing his own flesh and blood. Then came the cornerstone of their entire lawsuit. Sterling dramatically requested to enter Plaintiff's Exhibit A into the official court record. He unclasped a thick leather binder and pulled out a stack of printed emails. He paced slowly in front of the judge's bench, holding the papers aloft. He claimed these were historical communications between Clarence and myself, dating back exactly 10 years. With absolute conviction, Sterling began to read them aloud to the court. The fabricated text was sickeningly convincing. The emails portrayed a young, desperate version of myself, begging my father for the $5,000 tuition check. In the final email of the chain, the fake version of me explicitly promised that in exchange for this crucial seed capital, Clarence and Trey would be entitled to a 50% equity stake in any future corporate entity I founded. Sterling paused, letting the heavy implication of the words settle over the silent courtroom. He walked back to his table and placed a comforting hand on Clarence's shoulder. He looked directly at the judge, stating that these emails were undeniable, irrefutable proof of a binding verbal and digital contract. He argued that my entire empire at Vanguard Obsidian was built on a foundation funded by my father, and therefore half of it legally belonged to him. Monique leaned forward in the gallery, her smirk widening into a full grin. Trey nudged her, whispering something that made her silently laugh. They were completely intoxicated by their impending victory. They genuinely thought they had me trapped. Sterling called Clarence to the witness stand to authenticate the documents. My father took the oath, his hand resting firmly on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. He sat in the witness box, looking every bit the weary honorable elder. Sterling walked him through the timeline. He asked Clarence to confirm under the penalty of perjury that he had received these specific emails on the exact dates printed at the top of the pages. Clarence leaned toward the microphone, his voice thick with fake emotion, and definitively stated yes. He swore before the judge and the court reporter that the printed emails were accurate, unaltered, and had been sitting in his archived inbox for a full decade. He claimed he had only printed them recently when he realized his daughter intended to cheat him out of his rightful equity. Sterling smiled, thanked his client, and returned to his seat. He shot me a fleeting, arrogant look, effectively daring me to try and dismantle his flawless presentation. Judge Harrison turned his attention to my solitary table. He asked if the defense wished to cross-examine the witness. I stood up slowly. I did not carry a thick binder. I did not bring a legal pad. I held a single, slim, encrypted tablet. The courtroom was dead silent as I walked confidently toward the center of the floor. My heels struck the wood with a rhythmic, measured tempo. I stopped a few feet from the witness box, locking eyes with the man who had raised me, the man who had just committed a federal felony simply because he could not stand to see me win. I began my interrogation with a deceptively soft tone. I asked Clarence to confirm one final time that he possessed the original digital files of these emails. He narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious of my calm demeanor, but confidently answered yes. I turned to Judge Harrison and requested permission to project Defense Exhibit 1 onto the courtroom monitors. The judge granted it. I tapped the screen of my tablet. Instantly, the large LCD screens mounted on the courtroom walls illuminated. They did not show legal text. They displayed dense, cascading rows of raw, highlighted digital code. It was a complete forensic metadata extraction report. I walked toward Marcus Sterling's table, my voice rising slightly, adopting the sharp, authoritative cadence of a corporate auditor. I explained to the court that an email is not merely the text displayed on a screen. Every digital communication carries an invisible microscopic fingerprint, known as metadata. This data records the exact origin IP address, the routing servers, the specific device MAC address, and the precise millisecond a file is created, modified, and saved. I pointed directly at the largest screen. I broke down the raw code into devastating, undeniable English. I pointed to the first highlighted block of text. This, I explained, was the origin IP address for the emails Clarence had just sworn under oath were 10 years old. I presented the subpoenaed records from the internet service provider. The IP address did not belong to our old family home. It belonged to a luxury high-rise apartment complex in Midtown Atlanta. Specifically, it belonged to the exact apartment Trey had been evicted from just 2 months prior. Trey physically jolted in the gallery, his face draining of all color. Monique's triumphant grin vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. But I was not finished. I tapped my tablet again, bringing up the second highlighted block of data. I explained that every computer has a unique hardware identification number, a MAC address which acts like a digital license plate. I presented the cross-referenced Apple hardware registry. The MAC address embedded in the forged emails perfectly matched a MacBook Pro registered directly to Trey. Marcus Sterling bolted out of his chair. He shouted an objection, his slick composure entirely fractured. He claimed I was introducing complex technical evidence without laying the proper foundation. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down his face, a mask of absolute fury. He overruled the objection immediately, instructing me to continue. The judge was not looking at Sterling. He was glaring directly at Clarence. I stepped right up to the witness box. I was close enough to see the sweat pooling at Clarence's temples. I pulled up the final, most catastrophic piece of data. I explained the concept of time-stomping, a crude software manipulation tactic used to alter the visible date on a digital file. I pointed to the hidden server registry code on the screen. The true creation date of the emails was embedded deep in the unalterable server logs. The emails were not written 10 years ago. They had been typed, time-stomped, and saved exactly 21 days ago. They were created on a Tuesday evening, precisely 3 days after I had humiliated them at the charity gala. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. The perjury trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. I looked at Marcus Sterling, whose career was currently disintegrating before his eyes. He had submitted falsified evidence to a federal judge. He had suborned perjury. I turned my gaze back to Clarence. He looked small, old, and utterly defeated. He was gripping the edges of the witness stand so hard, his knuckles were entirely white. He could not look at me. He could not look at the judge. He stared at the floor, drowning in the reality of his own hubris. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I delivered the final fatal blow with absolute, terrifying calm. I stated for the official court record that the plaintiff and his legal counsel had engaged in a deliberate, coordinated conspiracy to defraud Vanguard Obsidian. They had fabricated digital evidence, filed fraudulent claims, and committed textbook perjury on the witness stand. I requested that the lawsuit be dismissed with extreme prejudice, and that all evidence of their fraud be immediately forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. Judge Harrison did not hesitate. He struck his gavel with a sound like a gunshot. He dismissed the case immediately. He then ordered Clarence and his attorneys to remain exactly where they were, instructing the bailiff to secure the courtroom doors. He announced that he was initiating an immediate inquiry into the submission of forged documents and criminal perjury. I turned away from the witness stand and began walking calmly down the aisle toward the heavy oak doors. I did not look at Trey as he sat frozen in terror. I did not look at Monique as she buried her face in her hands. I pushed the courtroom doors open and stepped out into the bright, sunlit corridor. The war was officially over. I had dismantled their lies, secured my empire, and left them trapped in a cage of their own making. I walked toward the elevators, leaving the ruins of my family entirely behind me. I had barely lowered my encrypted tablet when Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the cavernous courtroom, instructing everyone to remain seated. The perjury trap had completely destroyed their offensive strategy, but I was not finished. I had no intention of simply walking away with a standard dismissal. I intended to leave my father financially crippled so he could never afford to launch another malicious attack against me, my reputation, or my firm. I turned back to the judge and stated that I was filing an immediate motion for severe sanctions and the complete reimbursement of all my legal, administrative, and investigative costs. To justify the maximum possible penalty, I explained that I needed to prove this lawsuit was not merely a tragic family misunderstanding, but a highly calculated, malicious attempt at financial extortion funded by desperate illicit capital. I approached the defense table, unlatched my leather briefcase, and pulled out a secondary stack of highly classified financial documents. I handed the bailiff a thick bound dossier to deliver directly to the bench. These were not digital forensics or metadata logs. These were hard, undeniable bank records obtained through aggressive corporate subpoenas that I had filed weeks in advance. I turned to face the courtroom, locking my eyes onto Clarence, and began to narrate the absolute destruction of his hidden financial reality. I explained to the judge that the plaintiff did not have a legitimate financial grievance. He had a severe, catastrophic liquidity crisis. I displayed the property records for my family's sprawling, manicured ancestral estate in Buckhead. The house had been fully paid off years ago, standing as the ultimate physical symbol of my father's supposed wealth, prestige, and stability. However, the bank documents I submitted painted a starkly different, pathetic reality. I walked the judge through the timeline of Clarence's recent banking activity, with surgical precision. Less than 48 hours after I had publicly exposed Trey's fraudulent shell companies at the charity gala, Trey had been quietly arrested on federal wire fraud charges. Clarence, absolutely desperate to keep his golden child out of a federal holding cell, had secretly remortgaged the family estate for a fourth time. He had stripped every last available cent of equity from the property to post a massive cash bail for Trey. But Clarence did not stop at bailing out his son. I pointed to a secondary highly damning wire transfer, executed just 1 week later. My father had taken the remaining funds from that desperate high-interest equity loan and wired a staggering $200,000 directly to Marcus Sterling's law firm. Clarence had literally mortgaged his home, risking absolute foreclosure and complete homelessness to secure a ruthless attack dog for this fabricated lawsuit. He was bleeding himself dry to fund a war he could not possibly win, gambling his entire legacy on a forged email. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet, as the reality of my father's financial suicide was laid bare on the public record. Marcus Sterling sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, his face flushed with a mixture of intense rage and profound professional embarrassment. He knew his exorbitant retainer was paid with borrowed, desperate money, and now he was caught dead in the center of a criminal perjury scandal that would likely cost him his legal license. Judge Harrison reviewed the bank records, his expression hardening into absolute disgust. He looked down at Clarence, who was now trembling visibly in his tailored suit, completely stripped of his arrogant posture. The judge did not mince words. He declared the lawsuit a grotesque, malicious abuse of the judicial system. He formally dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning Clarence could never file these claims again. He then slammed his gavel and granted my motion for sanctions in full. He ordered Clarence to pay all of my incurred legal, forensic, and administrative costs, a staggering figure that would instantly push my father into immediate bankruptcy. The trap was complete. The financial bleed was irreversible. I packed my tablet and my documents into my briefcase with slow, deliberate precision. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, pushing through the heavy oak doors and stepping into the bright, echoing corridor of the courthouse, leaving the ruins of my family entirely behind me. I walked purposefully toward the bank of elevators at the end of the hall. The marble floors clicked under my heels, maintaining a sharp, steady rhythm of victory. I pressed the call button and watched the digital floor indicator tick downward. Before the elevator could arrive, the heavy courtroom doors slammed open behind me. I heard the frantic, heavy footsteps of multiple people charging down the corridor. I did not have to turn around to know exactly who was approaching. Clarence, Trey, and Monique closed the distance quickly, practically surrounding me in the alcove. The sheer delusion required to confront me after the absolute massacre they had just suffered was staggering. Clarence's face was a mottled, unhealthy shade of purple. His chest heaved with heavy, erratic breaths, and his hands were curled into tight, trembling fists. He was no longer trying to maintain his distinguished facade. He was a cornered, desperate animal lashing out blindly. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, stepping aggressively into my personal space. He sneered, his voice dripping with venom, and told me not to celebrate too early. He proudly declared that I might have won a minor legal skirmish, but I had not won the war. Despite the devastating federal perjury investigation looming over his head, despite the impending foreclosure of his home, his arrogance remained completely intact. He puffed out his chest and bragged that they did not need his estate or my Vanguard Obsidian equity anymore. Trey stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with our father. He adjusted the lapels of his suit and flashed that familiar, sickeningly confident grin. He proudly announced that his business ventures were far from dead. He bragged that he had just spent the last week successfully pitching a massive, highly lucrative commercial redevelopment project to a major institutional lender. He boasted that despite his recent legal troubles, his undeniable charisma and brilliant business plan had secured a massive lifeline. He had successfully closed a $2 million syndicated loan to fund his new empire. Monique chimed in, rubbing her pregnant belly with an air of absolute superiority. She sneered and told me that their new capital was going to make them untouchable. She claimed they were going to build a corporate portfolio that would completely eclipse mine. Clarence leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing whisper. He threatened that they were going to use their new multi-million-dollar funding to systematically destroy me. He bragged that their very first order of business was to purchase the commercial high-rise building that housed Vanguard Obsidian's corporate headquarters. He promised me with a dark, malicious gleam in his eye that the moment the ink dried on the property deed, he would personally draft and deliver my eviction notice. He swore he would throw me and my entire firm out onto the street. I stood perfectly still, letting his hollow threats wash over me. The sheer, blinding incompetence of my family was almost beautiful to witness. They were so addicted to the illusion of power that they never bothered to read the fine print. I tilted my head slightly, maintaining my cold, surgical calm. I asked Trey, in a tone of mild, detached curiosity, to name the institutional lender that had supposedly handed a known fraudster $2 million. Trey smirked clearly, believing he had secured the ultimate victory. He puffed up his chest and proudly stated the name, Apex Global Holdings. He bragged that they were a premier private equity group out of Chicago, and they had recognized his visionary talent immediately. I felt a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. I did not laugh. I did not gasp. I simply stared at my brother with absolute chilling pity. Apex Global Holdings was not a standalone private equity group out of Chicago. It was a secondary, highly specialized debt acquisition subsidiary. It was a shadow entity designed specifically to acquire high-risk commercial paper from desperate borrowers. I knew this with absolute undeniable certainty because Vanguard Obsidian owned Apex Global Holdings. I was the silent, majority managing partner of the exact firm that had just handed my brother his $2 million rope. I knew the exact architecture of the loan Trey had just signed. I knew that the master contract contained a lethal, non-negotiable cross-default clause. The clause explicitly stipulated that if the borrower was found guilty of perjury fraud or faced any active federal criminal investigations, the entire $2 million loan became immediately payable in full. If the borrower failed to produce the cash within 24 hours, the lender was legally authorized to seize every single asset tied to the borrower's name, including any co-signed collateral. Trey had just willingly signed over his financial soul and Clarence's remaining assets directly to my corporate portfolio. The moment the judge filed the perjury investigation report tomorrow morning, Trey's massive loan would instantly default. My subsidiary would legally seize the remaining fragments of their lives. They had practically handed me the executioner's sword and begged me to swing it. The elevator chimed loudly, the polished steel doors sliding open to reveal an empty car. I did not explain the corporate structure to them. I did not shatter their temporary delusion. Let them enjoy their final 24 hours of fake triumph. I stepped gracefully into the elevator and turned around to face my father, my brother, and my sister-in-law. I looked at their angry, arrogant faces one last time. I smirked, gave them a single mock salute, and simply said goodbye. The heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing them in the hallway, completely unaware that their total annihilation was already guaranteed. The descent from the courthouse was swift and entirely silent. The heavy steel doors of the elevator sealed me away from the pathetic display in the hallway and delivered me to the subterranean parking garage. My personal security detail held the door to my armored sedan. The ride back to the financial district passed in a blur of tinted glass and Atlanta traffic. I watched the skyline pass by my window with a profound sense of absolute ownership. My father had threatened to buy the commercial high-rise that housed my company. He had absolutely no idea that I already owned the entire city block. 10 minutes later, I stepped out of my private elevator and strode into the executive boardroom of Vanguard Obsidian. The room was a fortress of soundproof glass, polished black marble, and brushed steel overlooking the sprawling city below. My senior executive team was already assembled and waiting in perfect silence. They stood respectfully as I bypassed the standard leather chairs and took my seat at the absolute head of the massive table. For the past decade, I had operated strictly in the shadows. To the public, to my industry rivals, and to my profoundly ignorant family, I was simply a highly successful corporate executive. They believed I was a smart woman who had aggressively climbed the ranks of a prestigious firm. That was the careful, calculated illusion I intentionally maintained to keep predators looking in the wrong direction. The reality was far more dangerous and infinitely more lucrative. I was not an employee. I was the sole anonymous founding partner of Vanguard Obsidian. Every subsidiary, every holding company, every shadow equity firm operating under our massive umbrella answered directly and exclusively to me. I had built a multi-billion-dollar financial syndicate completely off the grid, using a complex labyrinth of proxy directors, blind trusts, and offshore holding companies to shield my true identity from the world. My chief operating officer, a sharp calculating man named David, slid a thick leather-bound portfolio across the polished marble table. He offered a cold, knowing smile as he opened it to the very first page. It was the finalized, executed master contract from Apex Global Holdings. The proxy director I had personally installed to run Apex had performed his role perfectly. Apex Global was my designated predatory lending arm, while the primary branches of Vanguard Obsidian handled legitimate blue-chip acquisitions and sustainable corporate mergers. Apex existed solely to issue high-interest, high-risk loans to desperate entities. We systematically targeted failing businesses, arrogant developers, and over-leveraged frauds. We offered them a massive financial lifeline wrapped entirely in razor wire. Trey had walked right into my slaughterhouse with his chest puffed out. He had approached Apex 2 weeks ago, pitching a phantom commercial redevelopment project. He had confidently presented falsified projection models, fabricated asset sheets, and fake vendor contracts, trying to secure enough capital to maintain his lavish lifestyle, after all his personal credit had dried up. My internal underwriting team had flagged the massive fraud immediately. Standard corporate protocol dictated that we deny the loan immediately and report the criminal attempt to the federal banking authorities. Instead, I personally ordered my underwriters to approve the full $2 million without hesitation. I instructed them to expedite the funding, bypass the standard vetting procedures, and rush the closing documents to his inbox. My executive team had initially questioned the directive. Handing $2 million in clean capital to a documented financial liability like Trey seemed like a terrible, unprecedented business decision. They did not understand that I was not making a traditional investment. I was building a custom guillotine. Sitting at the head of the table, I placed my hand flat against the signed contract. I traced the ink of my brother's signature. He had signed his name with a heavy, confident stroke, believing he had just outsmarted a massive, faceless corporate entity. He believed his natural charm and perceived brilliance had secured him a fortune. He had absolutely no idea he was negotiating directly with the sister he had spent his entire life trying to destroy. I looked around the boardroom, meeting the eyes of my top executives. They knew the trap was set. They knew the lawsuit had just been dismissed with prejudice, and the perjury investigation was officially active. The legal dominoes were already falling precisely as I had arranged them. Now it was time to trigger the final financial execution. I pulled the heavy contract closer and flipped directly to Section 4, Paragraph 8, the cross-default and immediate seizure clause. It was a notoriously ruthless stipulation buried deep within the dense, aggressive legal jargon of the Apex Master Agreement. My proxy director had ensured Trey waived his right to any standard grace period or financial mediation. The legal language was absolute and entirely unforgiving. If the borrower was subjected to any federal or state criminal investigation, the loan defaulted instantly. If the borrower misappropriated a single dollar of the commercial loan for personal or non-business expenses, the entire $2 million sum became immediately payable in full. If the borrower failed to return the capital within 24 hours, Apex held the irrevocable legal right to seize all corporate and personal assets associated with his name. Trey had not bothered to read the fine print. He had seen the $2 million approval stamp and blindly signed away his entire life. He was far too arrogant to hire a competent financial attorney to review the predatory terms. He genuinely assumed the rules of consequence did not apply to him. I tapped the touchscreen built into the surface of the boardroom table. The frosted glass wall at the far end of the room transitioned instantly into a massive glowing grid of financial monitors. Our cybersecurity and asset tracking division had linked Trey's newly funded business account directly to our real-time monitoring software. Standard operating protocol for high-risk Apex loans allowed us to track the exact disbursement of our capital down to the precise millisecond. I instructed my chief financial officer to bring up the live transaction ledger for Trey's account. The $2 million wire transfer had cleared just 3 hours ago while we were standing in the courthouse. The money was now fully accessible and burning a hole in his pocket. I leaned back in my leather chair and watched the monitors with clinical fascination. I knew my brother's twisted psychology flawlessly. I knew the intense burning insecurity that drove every single decision he made. He had just suffered a humiliating public defeat in the courthouse hallway. His father was facing imminent bankruptcy and severe criminal charges. Trey desperately needed a distraction. He needed to prove to himself and to Monique that he was still a king among men. He needed to feel unassailably rich. The first alert flashed bright red across the center screen. A massive wire transfer had just been initiated directly from the business account. The amount was $240,000. I read the recipient designation and let out a cold, quiet laugh that echoed in the silent boardroom. It was a luxury automotive dealership in Buckhead. Instead of securing commercial real estate permits or paying construction vendors as explicitly outlined in his loan agreement, Trey had immediately purchased a fully loaded matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. He had brazenly authorized the purchase under his phantom company name, claiming it was a necessary fleet vehicle for his redevelopment firm. 10 minutes later, a second alert pulsed violently on the screen. A debit card authorized to the primary account was swiped at a high-end jewelry boutique in Lenox Square. $85,000 vanished in an instant. The merchant code matched a dealer specializing in imported diamond watches. He was buying a Patek Philippe to match his brand-new truck. He was literally wearing my money on his wrist. I watched the ledger bleed in real time. It was an absolute masterclass in financial self-destruction. He was supposed to use this highly regulated capital to build a legitimate corporate infrastructure. Instead, he was rapidly hemorrhaging cash to construct a pathetic illusion of wealth. Another alert flared on the screen. $40,000 transferred to a luxury travel agency. He was booking a massive international vacation for himself and Monique to celebrate their fake success. By nightfall, the spending escalated from merely reckless to entirely unhinged. The monitoring software tracked his physical location via the continuous transaction pings. He was at a notorious ultra-exclusive nightclub in downtown Atlanta. A charge for $12,000 cleared immediately for a VIP table and premium bottle service. He was throwing a victory party using funds he had stolen from me. He was likely holding court in the center of the club, surrounded by sycophants and hangers on pouring ridiculously expensive champagne and bragging loudly about his new multi-million-dollar empire. He was happily burning the very evidence that would put him in a federal prison for the next decade. My chief financial officer looked at me across the polished table, his expression a complex mix of professional shock and clinical detachment. He asked if we should freeze the account and initiate the aggressive seizure protocols immediately to stop the financial bleeding. I shook my head, holding up a single hand to stop him. I wanted Trey to spend just a little more. I wanted him to wake up tomorrow morning in his new luxury vehicle, wearing his new diamond watch, completely convinced he had finally conquered the world. I wanted him to feel the absolute zenith of his artificial power before I ripped the entire floor out from under him. I instructed my legal team to prepare the immediate seizure warrants for 8 in the morning sharp. We would freeze the remaining capital, seize the new vehicles, attach heavy liens to every single personal account he or Clarence possessed, and file the massive fraud breach with the federal banking authorities simultaneously. The bait had been greedily swallowed, the iron trap was locked. Tomorrow morning I would finally show my family what true limitless power actually looked like. When tomorrow morning arrived, I sat in the boardroom with the seizure warrants perfectly aligned on my pristine desk. My hand hovered over the signature line, but I did not pick up my silver fountain pen. As I stared at the glowing monitors displaying Trey's frantic spending sprees, a far darker and infinitely more permanent strategy materialized in my mind. Executing the seizure today would undoubtedly crush my brother, but a swift, immediate execution was entirely too merciful. It lacked the crushing psychological weight of complete structural failure. I looked closely at the Apex Global Master Contract. The stipulations for the $2 million commercial loan were explicitly clear. The capital was strictly designated for corporate infrastructure, and the borrower was legally required to meet a mandatory operational milestone at exactly 30 days post-funding. By the 30th day, Trey was contractually obligated to submit certified architectural drafts, proof of commercial leasing, and authenticated vendor receipts to the lending committee. If I seized the funds immediately, I would only catch Trey in a web of personal fraud. But if I let the clock run out, if I gave him exactly 30 days to hang himself with his own sheer incompetence, he would trigger a catastrophic breach of contract that carried far heavier legal penalties. More importantly, the 30-day operational milestone was the exact trigger that locked the cosigner into absolute inescapable liability. I instructed my chief financial officer to hold the warrants. We were going to let the clock tick. For the next 4 weeks, I watched the digital ledger with the cold, calculated patience of an apex predator. Trey and Monique lived like absolute royalty on my dime. They believed they were completely untouchable. They abandoned their cramped rental and signed a year-long lease on a luxury penthouse in downtown Atlanta, paying 6 months upfront in cash. The matte black G-Wagon became a permanent fixture outside the city's most exclusive steakhouses and high-end boutiques. Monique documented every single second of their fraudulent lifestyle on social media, flaunting designer handbags, diamond tennis bracelets, and extravagant baby shower preparations. She posted photos of Trey holding court in VIP sections, holding bottles of premium champagne with captions bragging about his visionary genius and their unstoppable corporate empire. Not a single dollar went toward the commercial infrastructure outlined in the binding Apex agreement. No permits were ever filed, no architects were ever consulted, no commercial property was ever leased or even toured. Trey treated the $2 million corporate loan like a bottomless personal slush fund, entirely convinced that he could simply talk his way out of any required audits when the time came. He was banking on his lifelong ability to charm and manipulate his way past the rules. He had no idea that a forensic accountant was tracking every single swiped card, every wired transfer, and every ATM withdrawal down to the exact geographical coordinates. Day 30 finally arrived. The deadline for the mandatory operational milestone was exactly 5 in the evening. I sat in my penthouse war room, the very same space where I had meticulously dismantled their fabricated lawsuit. My chief operating officer, David, stood silently beside my desk, holding a fresh stack of legal binders. We watched the large digital clock on the primary monitor tick down the final remaining minutes. Trey had not submitted a single document. He had not uploaded a single vendor receipt to the secure Apex portal. He was completely oblivious to the deadline, entirely consumed by his own artificial grandeur. The digital clock shifted to 4:59, then 500. The deadline passed. A sharp automated chime echoed through the silent war room. The tracking system immediately flagged the Apex account. A solid crimson banner dropped across the primary monitor. Code 404, breach of contract. Mandatory operational milestone missed. The entire $2 million commercial loan was instantly legally reclassified as fraudulent misappropriation of funds. The trap had officially permanently snapped shut. David stepped forward and placed the final default authorization on my desk. He did not say a word. He simply handed me my pen. I looked down at the dense legal document outlining the exact mechanics of the call-in. When a borrower breaches an operational milestone under the aggressive terms of an Apex loan, the lender does not send a polite warning letter or request a mediation meeting. The lender triggers an immediate total recall of the debt. The entire $2 million plus exorbitant penalty fees became payable instantly. But Trey was entirely broke. He had burned through nearly $800,000 in 30 days and had absolutely no liquid capital to repay the remaining balance. This was the exact moment the trap transferred the lethal financial burden directly to the guarantor. I pulled the master contract toward me and flipped to the guarantor addendum. There, in shaky, desperate cursive, was my father's signature. Clarence had been so blinded by his hatred for me and his desperate obsession with redeeming his golden child that he had willingly co-signed the massive commercial loan. Because Trey had a ruined credit score and zero verifiable assets, Apex Global had required a heavy collateral pledge. Clarence had blindly offered up his sprawling ancestral estate in Buckhead as the ultimate guarantee. What my father had failed to understand in his rush to secure Trey's funding was the devastating reality of a cross-default clause. Clarence had already secretly remortgaged his estate to pay for Marcus Sterling's retainer and Trey's federal bail. His property was leveraged to the absolute breaking point, teetering on the edge of ruin. By signing the Apex Addendum, Clarence had explicitly agreed that upon a breach of contract by the primary borrower, the lender's lien immediately superseded all other claims. By guaranteeing Trey's fraudulent loan, Clarence had essentially handed me the keys to his entire life. I unscrewed the cap of my fountain pen. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name with a sharp, decisive stroke, authorizing Vanguard Obsidian to call in the entire $2 million debt instantly. David took the document and transmitted the execution order directly to the financial servers. The resulting shockwave was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Algorithms initiated a total lockdown across every single account linked to Trey's social security number. His shiny platinum cards were instantly frozen mid-swipe. The luxury automotive dealership received an automated legal notice to repossess the G-Wagon within the hour. The leasing office for their newly acquired penthouse received a formal notice of asset seizure, effectively freezing their right to access the property. In a matter of milliseconds, Trey went from a supposed multimillionaire to an unbanked penniless fraud, facing immediate federal charges for misappropriating commercial capital. But the most catastrophic blow was delivered directly to Clarence. A formal notice of immediate foreclosure and total asset seizure was electronically transmitted to Clarence's primary banking institution and hand-delivered to his front door by a process server. The notice explicitly detailed his liability as the co-signer on a defaulted fraudulent corporate loan. It demanded immediate payment in full. Because he had zero liquidity and no remaining equity to borrow against the default automatically triggered the immediate surrender of the collateral. Vanguard Obsidian did not just own the defaulted debt. We officially held the exclusive physical deed to Clarence's estate. I owned the manicured lawns, the sprawling driveway, and the heavy oak doors of the house I grew up in. I owned the very roof over my father's head. I stood up from my desk and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering expanse of the Atlanta skyline. The profound poetic justice of the moment settled over me like a heavy velvet cloak. Outside the courtroom 30 days ago, my father had looked me directly in the eye and sneered. He had arrogantly threatened to use his new private equity funding to purchase the commercial building that housed Vanguard Obsidian. He had promised to hand-deliver an eviction notice and throw me out onto the street. He had wanted to completely destroy my empire to prove his superiority. Instead, he had willingly financed his own total annihilation. He had borrowed money from his own daughter to fund his own destruction. I took a deep, calming breath and watched the city lights flicker below. My father wanted to play real estate tycoon. He wanted to weaponize property ownership to break my spirit. Now I held the official deed to his life. I was going to be the one drafting the eviction notice, and I was going to make sure he was removed from my property before the week was over. The Tuesday morning sun broke across the manicured lawns of the Buckhead estate, casting long golden shadows over the sweeping driveway. Inside the sprawling dining room, Clarence, Trey, and Monique were seated around the massive mahogany table, indulging in an extravagant catered breakfast. I observed this entire scene from the tinted rear window of my lead vehicle as our convoy idled just out of sight down the street. Through the live feed provided by the private investigators I had stationed in the woods beyond their property line, I watched them celebrate their imaginary victory. Trey was actively boasting, waving a silver fork in the air as he described the international vacation he had supposedly booked the night before. He casually mentioned that his new platinum card had been temporarily declined that morning when he tried to purchase a $10,000 custom crib for Monique. He foolishly dismissed the freeze as a simple bank security measure triggered by his massive spending spree. He had absolutely no idea his entire financial existence had been permanently erased. Monique sat beside him, sipping freshly squeezed orange juice and admiring the heavy diamond watch hanging loosely on Trey's wrist. Clarence presided at the head of the table wearing a silk robe and a smug, satisfied grin. He truly believed he had finally secured his legacy and crushed mine in the process. He believed he was the untouchable patriarch of an unstoppable dynasty. It was time to shatter the illusion entirely. I gave a sharp nod to my chief of security sitting in the passenger seat. He spoke a single word into his encrypted radio. The convoy moved. 4 matte black Cadillac Escalades moved in perfect synchronization, flanked by 3 fully marked county sheriff cruisers. We turned sharply onto the private road leading to the estate. The heavy wrought iron gates at the entrance were closed, but my security team had already bypassed the antiquated electronic lock. The gates swung open smoothly, offering no resistance to the incoming storm. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the pristine gravel of the circular driveway, shattering the quiet suburban morning. Inside the dining room, the clinking of expensive silverware stopped abruptly. Clarence stood up from his chair, his brow furrowed in deep annoyance. He marched toward the towering bay windows, expecting to scold a confused delivery driver or a lost landscaping crew. Instead, he was met with the flashing blue and red strobe lights of law enforcement illuminating his expensive brick facade. The vehicles formed a tight tactical perimeter around the front entrance, boxing in Trey's brand-new matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. 6 uniformed sheriff deputies stepped out of their cruisers, resting their hands casually against their tactical belts. Their presence was not aggressive, but it was an undeniable, absolute display of state-sanctioned authority. My private security detail stepped out of the Escalades, forming a secondary wall of solid muscle in tailored dark suits. Trey pushed his chair back from the table, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He jogged to the window, standing shoulder to shoulder with our father. His initial annoyance rapidly morphed into visible confusion. Monique hovered anxiously behind them, clutching her silk robe tightly around her pregnant belly. The sheer scale of the intrusion was impossible to ignore. This was not a simple neighborhood disturbance. This was a highly coordinated, targeted siege on their personal fortress. Clarence, completely unable to comprehend a reality where he was not in total control, threw open the massive double oak front doors. He marched out onto the sweeping stone portico, his chest puffed out in righteous indignation. He demanded to know who was in charge and threatened to call the police commissioner directly if the vehicles were not removed from his property within 60 seconds. Trey flanked him, puffing out his own chest and pointing an angry finger at the deputies, demanding they step away from his new vehicle immediately. They stood on the grand porch, shouting demands at a wall of silent, stone-faced professionals. The deputies did not answer. My security team did not flinch. They simply waited. I waited inside the quiet, climate-controlled cabin of the lead Escalade, letting their panic simmer. I wanted the cold, hard reality of the flashing lights to fully permeate their arrogant minds. I wanted them to realize that all their posturing and shouting meant absolutely nothing. When Clarence finally stopped yelling, breathless and red in the face, my driver stepped out and opened my door. I stepped out of the vehicle and planted my stiletto heels firmly onto the imported gravel. I wore a tailored crimson power suit, the fabric sharp and unyielding against the morning breeze. I carried a single black leather portfolio in my left hand. I did not rush. I walked toward the stone steps of the estate with the slow, deliberate cadence of a conqueror claiming her rightful territory. Clarence stared down at me from the portico. His initial confusion instantly dissolved into a sickening, arrogant smirk. His twisted mind immediately jumped to the most delusional conclusion possible. He genuinely believed I was broken. He thought the heavy police presence and the fleet of SUVs were a desperate, pathetic stunt to save my firm. He leaned against the stone balustrade, completely relaxed, and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He asked if I had finally come to my senses. He proudly declared that bringing the police would not stop the eviction notice he planned to serve me. He assumed I was standing in his driveway to beg for a financial compromise, to plead for mercy, because he believed he now owned the building housing my corporate headquarters. Trey laughed right along with him, crossing his arms and shaking his head at my supposed desperation. I stopped at the base of the stone steps. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of emotion. I looked directly into my father's eyes and shattered his world with absolute surgical precision. I told him I was not there to apologize, and I certainly was not there to negotiate. I walked up the remaining steps, closing the distance until I stood inches away from him on his own porch. I handed the thick black portfolio directly into his hands. I instructed him to open it and read the top line very carefully. Clarence scoffed, snatching the folder from my grasp. He flipped it open, expecting to find a desperate settlement offer or a plea for a corporate merger. His eyes scanned the crisp, heavy cardstock. I watched the exact second his reality collapsed. The smug, arrogant smirk practically melted off his face, leaving behind a hollow, slack-jawed mask of pure terror. All the color drained from his cheeks, rendering his skin a sickly pale gray. His hands began to tremble so violently the thick parchment rattled against the leather binding. Trey, sensing the sudden catastrophic shift in energy, leaned over our father's shoulder to read the document. The heavy embossed letterhead at the very top of the page was undeniable. It read, Vanguard Obsidian. Beneath the massive corporate logo in bold, undeniable print was my name, Principal Director and Managing Partner, Rochelle. I watched Trey's eyes dart frantically back and forth across the page, trying to decipher the aggressive legal terminology. I did not make him wait. I explained the situation to them with cold, brutal clarity. I informed my brother that Apex Global Holdings, the firm that had just handed him a $2 million commercial loan, was a shadow subsidiary fully owned and operated by Vanguard Obsidian. I told him that I personally approved his fraudulent loan, knowing he would immediately breach the contract. Trey stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him. He looked down at the diamond watch on his wrist, the realization finally hitting him that he had purchased it using my money. I turned my attention back to Clarence, who was struggling to breathe, clutching his chest as he stared at the eviction notice. I explained the mechanics of the cross-default clause. Because Trey missed the mandatory operational milestone, the entire $2 million debt had defaulted at exactly 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Because Clarence had foolishly co-signed that loan using this estate as collateral, the debt was now entirely his responsibility. And because he was completely bankrupt with absolutely zero liquidity, Vanguard Obsidian had legally seized the property. I tapped a manicured fingernail against the center of the document in his shaking hands. I told him that he was holding an official immediate notice to vacate. I informed him that the deed to the estate had already been transferred and legally recorded. I owned the manicured lawns. I owned the towering bay windows. I owned the very stone beneath his expensive slippers. Monique let out a sharp, terrified gasp from the doorway, finally understanding that her luxurious future had just been entirely eradicated. Trey lunged forward, his face twisted in desperate rage, screaming that it was illegal and that he would sue me for entrapment. Before he could take a second step, 2 sheriff deputies unclipped their batons and moved instantly up the stairs, flanking him and forcing him back. I stepped back down to the gravel driveway, smoothing the lapels of my crimson jacket. I looked up at the 3 of them standing ruined and broken on the porch of my new property. I informed them that the deputies were not there for my protection. They were there to execute the legal eviction order. I gave them exactly 15 minutes to gather a single bag of personal clothing and vacate my premises permanently. I turned my back on their screaming and crying, stepping gracefully back into my armored vehicle, leaving my father and brother to the cold, unforgiving reality of the street. The tinted window rolled up, completely silencing the frantic screaming of my brother and the desperate, pathetic pleas of my father. I settled back into the plush leather seat and watched the monitor mounted on the partition. The live feed from the porch security camera captured the entire humiliating spectacle in high definition. Trey was pacing wildly, his hands tearing at his hair as a sheriff's deputy firmly instructed him to pack a single bag. Monique was weeping on the front steps, her designer silk robe dragging in the dust as she realized she was leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back. Clarence stood frozen, his eyes vacant, completely shattered by the absolute destruction of his ego. They had exactly 15 minutes. I monitored the countdown on my tablet with cold precision. At the 14-minute mark, Trey stormed out the front doors, carrying a duffel bag, his face twisted in a mask of impotent rage. He glared at my idling Escalade, but a heavily armed deputy stepped between us, gesturing firmly toward the street. They had no vehicles. The brand new G-Wagon had already been loaded onto a flatbed tow truck by my recovery team. My father's vintage Porsche was secured with a heavy steel wheel lock. They were forced to walk down the long, sweeping driveway on foot. The visual of Clarence, Trey, and Monique trudging down the gravel path, dragging their meager belongings toward the main road, was the ultimate portrait of their self-inflicted defeat. Once the heavy iron gates clanged shut behind them, my driver slowly navigated the Escalade back up the driveway. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the stone steps. The heavy oak doors stood wide open, offering a silent surrender. I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer. The house was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood, a stifling monument to my father's oppressive authority and endless narcissism. But the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. It no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a conquered territory. I walked through the sprawling rooms with my chief operating officer, David, falling into step beside me. I instructed him to immediately dispatch our corporate liquidation team. I wanted every piece of furniture, every antique rug, and every piece of expensive artwork cataloged, appraised, and sold at auction by the end of the week. I specifically ordered the removal of every family portrait and commendation hanging on the walls. They were to be thrown directly into the industrial dumpsters we had staged out back. The proceeds from the auction would be funneled directly into Vanguard Obsidian's philanthropic arm, specifically funding shelters and legal aid for marginalized women. The poetic justice of using my father's deeply patriarchal wealth to fund the very demographics he despised was a highly satisfying secondary victory. We reached my father's expansive mahogany study. The room where he had once belittled my ambitions and dismissed my worth was now simply another seized asset in my portfolio. I sat down in his heavy leather chair behind the massive desk. I ran my hand along the polished wood, feeling the absolute certainty of my position. David handed me a secure, encrypted tablet displaying the morning's financial news feeds. The media had already caught wind of the spectacular collapse. The headlines were ruthless and immediate. Financial publications and local news outlets were breaking the story of Trey's massive commercial default and the subsequent seizure of Clarence's highly leveraged estate. The public humiliation was absolute. Marcus Sterling, their corrupt attack dog attorney, had officially been disbarred and was facing a severe federal indictment for his role in the perjury scheme. Apex Global Holdings was being praised in the financial sector for its aggressive, flawless execution of high-risk debt recovery. My corporate anonymity remained entirely intact, shielding me from the media circus while I pulled every single string from the shadows. Over the next 48 hours, the true gravity of their situation settled over my former family. Without my father's wealth to shield him, Trey was immediately indicted on federal wire fraud charges. His desperate attempt to secure the Apex loan using fabricated corporate documents had triggered a swift and merciless response from federal banking regulators. Because he had no money for a defense attorney, he was assigned a public defender who quickly advised him to accept a harsh plea deal. He was facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Monique abandoned him the second the bank accounts were frozen. She quickly realized the extravagant lifestyle she had married into was nothing more than a hollow illusion. She filed for an emergency annulment and moved back to her hometown, completely erasing Trey from her life before he ever stepped foot in a courtroom. As for Clarence, the psychological destruction was far worse than the financial ruin. He had lost his estate, his golden child, and his pristine reputation in a matter of days. He was forced to move into a cramped, low-income apartment on the outskirts of the city, relying entirely on a meager state pension. The distinguished patriarch, who had once commanded boardrooms and dictated the lives of everyone around him, was reduced to absolute irrelevance. He had gambled his entire legacy on his arrogant belief that he could control me, and he had lost everything. I locked the tablet and handed it back to David. The war was officially over. I had systematically dismantled the men who had tried to break me, turning their own greed and arrogance into the precise instruments of their destruction. I stood up from my father's desk, leaving the dark, oppressive study entirely behind me. I instructed my security team to secure the perimeter and handed the keys to the estate over to my asset management director. I had absolutely no intention of living in this house. It was a trophy of war, a property to be gutted, completely renovated, and flipped for a massive corporate profit. I walked out the front doors and stepped back into the bright Atlanta sunlight. The air felt incredibly crisp and completely clean. I slid into the back of my armored Escalade, the leather interior cool and familiar. As the convoy rolled smoothly down the driveway and out through the iron gates, I did not look back at the estate. I had a multi-billion-dollar empire to run, an elite corporate syndicate to manage, and a future entirely of my own flawless making. The shadows had served me perfectly to build my power, but the view from the absolute top was blindingly bright. The shadows had served me perfectly to build my power, but the view from the absolute top was blindingly bright. My lead driver, Tuan, smoothly shifted the armored Escalade into gear, preparing to roll down the sweeping driveway and leave the Buckhead estate behind forever. But before the heavy tires could complete a single revolution, a frantic figure threw himself directly into the path of the imposing vehicle. Tuan slammed on the brakes, the sudden stop throwing me forward against my seatbelt. I looked through the reinforced windshield to see Clarence standing in the center of the gravel path, his arms spread wide like a desperate martyr. His expensive silk robe was disheveled, hanging loosely off his shoulders, and his chest heaved with panicked, ragged breaths. The smug, untouchable patriarch I had known my entire life had completely evaporated. In his place stood a broken, terrified old man who had finally comprehended the absolute, inescapable totality of his ruin. I tapped the intercom button, instructing Tuan to hold our position. The scene playing out through the windshield was breathtakingly vivid, sharp, and highly resolved, like a masterfully directed 4K cinematic climax. It was the perfect culmination of my meticulously plotted dark revenge. Clarence stumbled toward the rear passenger door, pressing his trembling hands flat against the tinted glass. I lowered the window just enough to let the crisp morning air and the sound of his desperate pleading enter the quiet cabin. "Rochelle, please, you cannot do this." Clarence gasped, his voice cracking as he peered into the dark interior of the SUV. The horrifying realization of his financial execution had finally shattered his delusions. He now understood that Vanguard Obsidian had not simply outmaneuvered him, but had legally consumed his entire existence. He realized that every signature he had proudly provided to secure Trey's commercial loan had been a fatal strike against his own throat. "I am your father, Rochelle. We share the same blood. You are family. You cannot put your own flesh and blood out on the street." I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The blood and family card was the most pathetic, predictable weapon in his arsenal, and he was wielding it decades too late. "Blood did not stop you from trying to destroy my firm," I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "Family did not stop you from standing outside that courthouse and threatening to buy the building out from under me so you could personally hand-deliver an eviction notice. You wanted to leverage your new equity to throw me into the gutter. The only difference between us, Clarence, is that your threats were nothing but arrogant delusions. My threats are legally binding." "Trey made a mistake," Clarence pleaded, gripping the window frame as if his life depended on it. "He got in over his head with the Apex contract. We can fix this. I can liquidate assets. I can talk to my private equity partners. Just give us time. Do not seize the house, Rochelle. This is your childhood home. This is our legacy." "You have no assets left to liquidate," I stated, stating the facts with the clinical precision of a forensic auditor. "Your private equity partners froze your accounts the millisecond the federal wire fraud indictment hit the wire this morning. You mortgaged this legacy to the absolute breaking point to pay for Trey's federal bail and Marcus Sterling's legal retainers. You handed me the keys to your kingdom the moment you co-signed that loan. You chose your golden child over basic financial literacy, and now you are paying the ultimate price." Clarence's knees visibly buckled. He leaned heavily against the door panel, his face slick with cold sweat. Behind him, I could see Trey standing paralyzed on the stone portico, completely unable to process the collapse of his fraudulent empire. Trey had always relied on our father to shield him from the consequences of his incompetence, but the shield had just been thoroughly, permanently shattered. "Please, Rochelle," Clarence whispered, tears spilling over his cheeks and dropping onto the collar of his silk robe. "I am begging you. I have nowhere else to go. We have nothing left." Watching the man who had tormented me, dismissed me, and actively tried to ruin me beg for mercy was the defining moment of my entire corporate career. I did not feel pity. I did not feel regret. I felt the profound, settling weight of absolute justice. I reached for the door handle and pushed the heavy armored door open, forcing Clarence to step back onto the gravel. I stepped out of the vehicle, standing tall in my crimson suit, towering over the defeated man cowering before me. The morning sunlight caught the polished sheen of my stiletto heels as I closed the distance between us. I looked at Clarence, taking in every detail of his utter defeat. I wanted this moment burned into his memory for the rest of his miserable life. I wanted the sound of my voice to echo in his ears every single night he spent sleeping in whatever cramped, low-income apartment he would eventually be forced to rent. "You said Trey deserved my penthouse," I asked, my voice ringing out clearly across the silent, manicured lawns. "You were wrong. He doesn't even deserve your house. Because as of 9 a.m. this morning, this property belongs to Vanguard Obsidian. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack your bags." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The finality of the statement severed whatever lingering, desperate hope he had been clinging to. The 30-minute deadline was not a negotiation. It was a hard, unyielding execution order. I turned away from him, dismissing his existence entirely. I signaled to the sheriff deputies standing guard near the portico, instructing them to enforce the strict time limit. They immediately moved forward, their hands resting casually on their utility belts, flanking Clarence and directing him back toward the open front doors. I watched as the deputies marched my father up the stone steps, forcing him to confront Trey, who was still frozen in shock. The illusion of their superiority had been burned to ash, leaving behind two terrified men facing the cold, hard consequences of their own boundless greed. I stepped back into the Escalade, the heavy door sealing with a solid, reassuring thud. Tuan engaged the engine, and the powerful SUV glided smoothly away from the scene of my ultimate victory. The tires rolled over the pristine gravel, leaving deep tracks in the driveway I now officially owned. As we passed through the towering wrought iron gates and turned onto the main road, I did not bother looking back in the rearview mirror. I had legally, surgically excised the poison from my life. The glorious severance was complete, and my empire was untouchable. Even as Tuan navigated the Escalade toward the highway, my tablet remained illuminated with the live security feed from the estate. I could not resist watching the immediate aftermath of their structural collapse. The high-definition cameras captured every agonizing second of their reality, shattering into a million jagged pieces. The 30-minute deadline was expiring, and the sheriff deputies were systematically pushing the three of them out of the grand foyer and onto the front lawn. They were allowed one bag each. Monique stood on the pristine grass, staring at the single designer duffel bag at her feet. The silk robe she had worn during their luxurious breakfast was now violently blowing in the crisp morning wind. She looked up at the towering brick facade of the mansion and then turned her gaze toward Trey. The transformation was instantaneous and brutal. The loving, supportive facade she had maintained while swiping his platinum cards vanished completely. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged forward, shoving Trey hard in the chest. Her voice echoed across the expansive lawn, captured perfectly by the audio receivers. She screamed that he was a complete fraud, a pathetic liar who had ruined her life. She demanded to know where the penthouse was. She screamed about the baby shower, the luxury vacations, the $10,000 crib that had been declined just an hour ago. She backed him toward the stone fountain, berating him for his sheer incompetence. She realized in that exact moment that there was no corporate dynasty. There was no untouchable wealth. She had tied herself to a penniless criminal facing federal wire fraud charges. Trey held his hands up in a desperate defensive gesture, begging her to calm down and promising he could fix the situation. He frantically patted his pockets, searching for a phone that had already been disconnected for a bank card that was completely frozen. He tried to grab her hands to spin another web of lies, but she violently slapped him away. She called him a worthless loser, an arrogant child playing dress-up with his sister's money. Every insult she hurled was a precision strike against his fragile ego, tearing down the golden boy image he had cultivated his entire life. While Monique verbally dismantled him, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine interrupted her screaming. A massive flatbed tow truck reversed slowly up the driveway, its amber lights flashing in rhythm with the police cruisers. The driver hopped out, pulling on a pair of heavy leather work gloves, and walked straight toward Trey's matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. The vehicle that had served as his ultimate status symbol, his chariot of fake success, was being casually hooked up to a steel winch. Trey abandoned Monique and ran toward the tow truck, his arms flailing. He ordered the driver to stop, screaming that the car was a legally leased corporate vehicle. The driver did not even bother making eye contact. He simply handed Trey a clipboard with the Vanguard Obsidian asset seizure authorization and engaged the hydraulic winch. The heavy steel cable pulled taut, dragging the luxury SUV onto the metal ramp with a loud metallic screech. That sound broke something fundamental inside my brother. He stopped shouting. His arms fell limply to his sides. He watched his prized possession being hoisted away, and his legs simply gave out. Trey collapsed onto the damp morning grass, falling directly to his knees. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The golden child, the arrogant heir apparent to the Addams dynasty, was weeping on the lawn like a helpless infant. He had no car, no money, no penthouse, and no future. His entire identity had been wrapped in unearned wealth, and without it, he was absolutely nothing. Monique stood a few feet away, looking down at him with sheer disgust. She did not offer a comforting hand or a sympathetic word. She simply picked up her single duffel bag and turned her back on him completely, severing their bond. She walked toward the edge of the property, dialing a friend to come rescue her from the wreckage. Trey remained on his knees, his shoulders heaving with every sob, entirely isolated in his profound failure. While Trey fell apart on the lawn, my father was experiencing a completely different kind of destruction. The security feed shifted to the stone portico where Clarence was leaning heavily against a massive white pillar. He was clutching the left side of his chest, his knuckles white against the fabric of his ruined silk robe. His breathing was visibly shallow and rapid. This was not a medical emergency, but a severe panic attack induced by the sudden catastrophic loss of his entire kingdom. He looked up at the towering windows of his study, the manicured rose bushes he had paid a fortune to maintain, and the heavy oak doors that were now securely locked behind him. A sheriff deputy stood firmly on the top step, blocking any chance of re-entry. Clarence had spent his entire life building an empire of intimidation and control. He had weaponized his wealth to dictate the lives of everyone around him, including mine. He had genuinely believed his legacy was untouchable and his authority absolute. Now he was a trespasser on his own property. The deputy pointed a stern finger down the long, winding driveway, indicating that their 30 minutes were officially over. They had to leave the premises immediately. Clarence slowly pushed himself away from the pillar, his movements stiff and agonizingly slow. He looked 10 years older than he had just an hour prior. The vibrant, arrogant patriarch had withered into a frail, defeated old man. He stumbled down the stone steps, his legs shaking with every movement. He reached the gravel path and grabbed the handle of his rolling suitcase. Trey eventually pulled himself up from the grass, wiping his tear-stained face. He grabbed his own heavy bag and moved to stand beside our father. They did not speak to each other. The sheer weight of their collective failure hung between them like a suffocating shroud. They turned and faced the quarter-mile stretch of crushed stone that separated the estate from the main road. I watched the screen intently as they began their march. The rhythmic crunch of their shoes dragging through the gravel was picked up by the exterior microphones. It was a slow, agonizing procession. The bags they were forced to carry were heavy, filled with whatever meager belongings they could frantically stuff inside during those 15 minutes. They were wearing expensive house slippers that offered zero support against the sharp, uneven stones. Every step looked painful. Every yard they covered served as a punishing reminder of their spectacular downfall. As I watched them struggle down the path, a profound sense of symmetry washed over me. Exactly 30 days ago, these two men had marched into the sleek glass lobby of my corporate headquarters. They had ridden the elevator to my penthouse suite armed with fabricated legal documents and unearned arrogance. They had stood in my war room and arrogantly demanded I pack my bags and vacate my own property. They had tried to orchestrate a humiliating public eviction, hoping to break my spirit and seize my empire. They had wanted me to experience the exact crushing walk of shame they were currently enduring. The poetic justice was absolutely flawless. I had not simply repelled their attack. I had reflected it back onto them, magnified by 1,000. I had let them dig their own graves using the very greed and entitlement that defined their existence. They had willingly signed the contracts, they had foolishly leveraged their ancestral home, and they had gleefully squandered the fraudulent funds. I had merely provided the rope. Clarence stopped halfway down the driveway, gasping for air. He dropped the handle of his suitcase and bent over, resting his hands on his knees. Trey stopped beside him but offered no assistance. They were entirely broken men, stripped of their power, their assets, and their dignity. They had completely alienated the only person capable of saving them. I turned off the tablet screen, plunging the cabin of the Escalade into quiet darkness. The live feed was no longer necessary. The visual of my father and brother dragging their luggage through the dirt was permanently seared into my mind, serving as the ultimate testament to my victory. I leaned my head against the soft leather headrest and closed my eyes, allowing a slow, triumphant smile to touch my lips. Vanguard Obsidian was expanding, the real estate portfolio was growing, and my corporate syndicate was stronger than ever. I had severed the dead weight of my toxic family, leaving them in the ruins of their own making. My future was completely unburdened, and the empire I built was finally entirely mine. 6 months later, the dust had completely settled over the crater where the Adams legacy once proudly stood. The swift and brutal liquidation of their assets had wiped them from the Atlanta elite with surgical precision, leaving absolutely no trace of their former glory. Clarence was now residing in a cramped, low-income apartment complex on the outer, desolate edges of the city. The sprawling mahogany study where he had once dictated terms and crushed ambitions was permanently replaced by a tiny, humid living room that perpetually smelled of stale cooking grease and cheap bleach. His entire world had shrunk to 4 thin walls, where he could clearly hear every heavy footstep of the upstairs neighbors and every police siren wailing down the busy avenue outside. He spent his days sitting in a worn fabric recliner, staring vacantly at a small, static-filled television screen. His pristine tailored suits had been auctioned off, leaving him to shuffle around in discount sweatpants and faded undershirts. His exclusive country club memberships were revoked. His former business associates had aggressively blocked his number. The sycophants who used to hang on his every word had vanished the exact second the Vanguard Obsidian acquisition hit the financial news cycle. He had no estate to manage, no wealth to wield, and absolutely no power left to exert over anyone. The psychological torment of his sudden irrelevance was a prison far worse than any physical cell. He had gambled his entire existence on the arrogant assumption that he could command the universe and control my destiny. Now he was choking on the bitter ashes of his own monumental hubris, entirely forgotten by the world he once thought he ruled. Trey was enduring an equally spectacular daily humiliation. Stripped of the protective shield of our father's money and heavily burdened by the crushing restitution terms of his federal plea deal, he was forced into the only sector that would hire a convicted corporate fraudster. He was working a grueling minimum wage retail job at a massive big box home improvement store. The golden child who once paraded around Buckhead in custom Italian suits and drove a matte black G-Wagon now wore a stiff fluorescent orange polyester vest with a plastic name tag pinned slightly crooked on his chest. He spent 8 exhausting hours a day standing on unforgiving concrete floors, hauling heavy bags of mulch, and taking vicious verbal abuse from impatient contractors over expired coupons. His manicured hands were now calloused and blistered. Every single paycheck he earned was aggressively garnished by federal regulators to slowly chip away at the massive mountain of debt he had foolishly accumulated. He was forced to take a 2-hour public bus ride each way, enduring the stifling humidity of transit, while staring out the smudged windows at the luxury vehicles he used to consider his absolute birthright. The toxic cycle that had defined their relationship for decades was permanently broken. Without the central pillar of unearned wealth to hold them together, their sick codependence completely disintegrated. They rarely spoke to each other anymore. Clarence bitterly blamed Trey for signing the fraudulent loan and destroying their name. Trey furiously blamed Clarence for failing to magically fix the situation and feeding his delusions of adequacy. They were two drowning men who had finally realized that pulling each other down would not keep them afloat. They were entirely isolated, trapped forever in the suffocating reality of their own consequences. High above the gritty reality of their daily struggles, I stood in the center of my flawless domain. My penthouse suite was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a silent fortress of gleaming marble-polished steel and floor-to-ceiling glass. I walked past the massive dining table where I had plotted their demise, stepping smoothly onto the sprawling outdoor terrace. The oppressive humidity of the Georgia summer had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, incredibly clear evening. The transition from day to night was currently painting the Atlanta skyline in a breathtaking array of vibrant colors. Brilliant streaks of burnt orange and deep violet bled across the horizon, reflecting off the towering glass and steel monuments of the financial district. This was my city. I had conquered it not by birthright or patriarchal favor, but by sheer relentless execution. The air up here was thin and pure, completely untainted by the desperation and deceit that choked the streets below. I stepped closer to the edge of the reinforced glass balcony railing, feeling the cool evening breeze sweep past my face and catch the edges of my tailored silk blazer. I held a delicate crystal glass in my right hand, swirling a vintage full-bodied Bordeaux. The deep red liquid coated the sides of the glass, catching the fading sunlight like liquid rubies. I took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the complex, rich flavors settle on my palate. The wine tasted like absolute, unadulterated victory. Vanguard Obsidian had just closed another record-breaking quarter. The liquidation of the Adams estate had provided a massive influx of capital, which my firm had aggressively reinvested into a highly lucrative commercial development project downtown. My corporate syndicate was expanding across state lines, executing hostile takeovers and high-risk acquisitions with terrifying, flawless precision. Marcus Sterling was currently serving the first year of a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary, his legal career permanently destroyed, and his reputation in tatters. My corporate anonymity remained an impenetrable fortress, shielding me from the petty scrutiny of the media while allowing me to maneuver through the global markets like a ghost. I held the strings, and I pulled them exactly when I desired. I looked down at the glittering grid of headlights navigating the congested highways thousands of feet below. I felt absolutely untouchable. There was no lingering guilt in my chest, no second-guessing the surgical destruction I had orchestrated. For years they had demanded I shrink myself to fit into the tiny, pathetic box they had constructed for me. They had demanded I apologize for my brilliance and surrender my hard-earned success to subsidize their profound incompetence. They had mistaken my quiet, strategic patience for weakness. They had assumed that the outdated rules of our bloodline would somehow protect them from the ruthless reality of the corporate battlefield. They were tragically mistaken. I had not just defeated them, I had completely erased them from the board. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the city into a brilliant sea of artificial light. The penthouse was silent, save for the soft ambient hum of the climate control system and the faint distant sound of city traffic. It was a silence filled with absolute untouchable peace. I took one final look at the sprawling empire stretched out beneath me, feeling the solid, unyielding concrete of my own foundation beneath my feet. I raised my glass to the darkening sky, offering a silent toast to the ruthless, relentless woman I had been forced to become to survive and conquer. Blood doesn't make a family, it just makes you related. True security isn't inherited, it is built protected, and sometimes it requires burning down the rotting foundation of your past to clear the view for your future.